Hundreds of bombs hit Tel Aviv. Deadly attack! Yemeni cluster missiles destroy Israeli defenses. Good evening, I'm Lawrence O'Donnell. And tonight, we begin with a story that feels like it's shaking the very ground beneath the Middle East. Hundreds of bombs rain down on Tel Aviv. Yes, you heard that right. Reports are emerging of a deadly attack. Yemeni launched cluster missiles breaking through layers of Israeli defense systems. And the question tonight is, what does this mean for Israel, for Gaza, and for a region already teetering on the edge of catastrophe? The story of Israel's Iron Dome has, for more than a decade, been a story of reassurance. It has been described as the invisible umbrella over Tel Aviv, the impenetrable wall that separates ordinary citizens from the nightmare of missile warfare. For years, it has been celebrated on the evening news and in congressional hearings as the gold standard of modern defense technology. But tonight, that narrative has been shaken, perhaps shattered by an attack that no one expected to succeed. Yemeni cluster missiles, crude by comparison to Israel's sophisticated weaponry, somehow broke through, sending waves of explosions across one of the most heavily defended cities in the world. The question we must ask is simple but terrifying. If the Iron Dome can be penetrated, what else is vulnerable? The Iron Dome has been held up as more than a defense system. It is a symbol, a promise to the people of Israel that they can live normal lives under abnormal conditions. For mothers in Tel Aviv tucking their children into bed, for shopkeepers opening their stores, for teachers leading classrooms, the knowledge that the Iron Dome was always watching the skies provided a sense of security. Tonight, that sense of security has been cracked open. Families who once trusted the alarm sirens and the dome's interception rate suddenly wonder if the shield is no longer reliable. And when that kind of doubt creeps in, it doesn't just change behavior, it changes the national psyche. Here is the hook: vulnerability is contagious. Once it is revealed, it spreads faster than the missiles themselves for adversaries across the region, in Gaza, in Lebanon, in Tehran, and now in Yemen. This breach will be studied, celebrated, and repeated. A weapon that was once dismissed as too weak to matter has now become a headline, a point of pride for Israel's enemies, and a source of deep anxiety for its allies. And in geopolitics, perception can be just as powerful as reality. The perception tonight is that Israel is no longer untouchable. Think about the timing. At a moment when tensions in Gaza remain raw, when Hezbollah continues to threaten from the north, this strike from Yemen widens the battlefield in a way few analysts thought possible. The Iron Dome was designed to handle a certain kind of threat, mostly short-range rockets. But cluster munitions launched from far away in waves designed to overwhelm the system have exposed its limits. The unthinkable happened. The sky filled with missiles that slipped past the dome, exploding in Tel Aviv neighborhoods that had long believed themselves safe. It is not only the sound of bombs that echoed tonight, it is the sound of confidence collapsing. The United States, which has poured billions into supporting Israel's missile defense, now faces uncomfortable questions. If this system can be breached, how effective is the investment? How long before adversaries armed with even more sophisticated weapons test the system again and again and again? Washington will have to decide whether to double down on defense funding or rethink its entire strategy. And make no mistake, members of Congress, the Pentagon and the White House are watching tonight's images of Tel Aviv very closely, calculating the risks of a broader war. And here is another hook. When the world's most advanced defense system fails, it is not just a technological failure. It is a psychological earthquake. Civilians who once felt protected now feel exposed. Leaders who once spoke confidently about security now speak cautiously about resilience. And adversaries who once doubted their chances now see opportunities. In a single night, the myth of invulnerability has been pierced, and with it, the balance of deterrence in the region may begin to shift. The story tonight is not only about bombs falling on Tel Aviv. It is about the unraveling of a belief system that has defined Israeli security for years. The Iron Dome was supposed to be the ultimate protector, the wall between chaos and order. But tonight, that wall has cracks. And in those cracks, Israel's enemies see hope and Israel's citizens see fear. That is what makes this moment not just another headline, but a turning point. The breach of the Iron Dome is not merely an event, it is a revelation. Tel Aviv has long been presented to the world as Israel's shining jewel, a city of glass towers and bustling markets, of nightlife and startups, of confidence and modernity. It is not just Israel's economic hub, but its cultural heart, the place that symbolizes normalcy in a country surrounded by conflict. And yet, Tonight, that very heart was shaken as hundreds of bombs fell from the sky. Imagine for a moment what that means. Streets that only yesterday echoed with music, laughter, and the rhythm of ordinary life are now littered with shattered glass and twisted metal. Families who gathered in cafes or strolled along the boulevards found themselves sprinting for cover, clutching children, listening for the dreaded whistle of incoming fire. Tel Aviv, the city that was supposed to be untouchable, is now the front line. The hook is in the contrast. This is not a border town under sporadic attack. This is not a military installation. This is Tel Aviv, the beating heart of Israel, the city that has always been used as proof that life goes on no matter what happens in Gaza or the West Bank. And now, the bombs have landed there. That shift carries enormous weight, not just militarily but symbolically. For every Israeli who once believed Tel Aviv was immune, tonight's images send a devastating message: nowhere is safe. The scale of this assault is staggering. Reports suggest wave after wave of missiles struck the city, overwhelming warning systems and testing the resilience of shelters and emergency responders. Sirens blared across neighborhoods as families scrambled into stairwells and underground parking garages. The sound of explosions reverberated through apartment blocks, followed by the deafening silence of disbelief. What happens to a nation's sense of security when its most vibrant city suddenly looks like a battlefield? What happens to the identity of a country that has always marketed Tel Aviv as the place where life is normal, where tourists can sip coffee while the rest of the region burns? Here is the uncomfortable truth: the bombs that fell on Tel Aviv were not just weapons of war. They were weapons of psychology. The very act of striking Israel's core city is designed to send a message that Israel's enemies can reach beyond the periphery, beyond the contested borders, straight into the center. This is the hook that cannot be ignored. A strike on Tel Aviv is not about military gain, it is about humiliation. It is about shattering the illusion that the country's greatest city stands above the fray. For Israel's leadership, the political fallout will be immense. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has built much of his career on the promise of security, the assurance that under his watch Israel would remain strong and untouchable. Tonight, those assurances lie in ruins alongside the debris on Tel Aviv's streets. Opposition voices will seize on this, asking how the government could allow such a breach, how it could fail to anticipate an attack of this magnitude. And beyond Israel, allies in Washington and European capitals will be forced to reckon with the reality that their closest partner in the Middle East is facing vulnerability at its very core. The humanitarian cost cannot be separated from the politics. In homes across the city, families will spend tonight huddled together, some without electricity, some without news of loved ones, all carrying the trauma of knowing how close death came. Hospitals are filling with the injured, emergency workers are stretched thin, and children will wake tomorrow with memories of explosions they may never forget. This is not just the destruction of buildings, it is the fracturing of a society's confidence. And so we come to another hook. Tel Aviv was supposed to be the showcase of Israeli resilience, the symbol that no matter what happens in the region, Israel's future is secure, modern, and thriving. Tonight, that symbol lies under attack. The bombs that fell were not only military strikes, they were direct hits on Israel's image, on its identity, and on the story it tells the world about itself. That is why this moment resonates far beyond the borders of Israel. Because if Tel Aviv can burn, if Tel Aviv can be shaken, then the narrative of stability in the Middle East has just been rewritten in fire. For years, military strategists in Israel have spoken about the nightmare scenario, not one front, not two fronts, but many. A conflict where rockets are fired not just from Gaza, not just from Lebanon, but from every direction at once, stretching Israel's defenses thin, forcing impossible choices, and creating chaos across the map. Tonight, that nightmare has stepped closer to reality. With missiles fired from Yemen, Hezbollah rattling its sabers in the north, and Gaza still burning with fury, Israel now stares at the prospect of a multi-front war. And here is the hook: no army in the world, not even Israel's, can fight everywhere at once without cracks beginning to show. The strength of Israel's military has always been its focus. When Gaza flared, forces were shifted south. When Hezbollah threatened, forces moved north. The system was designed for singular, concentrated battles. But what happens when enemies coordinate, when Gaza, Lebanon, and Yemen strike together? The answer is chaos, confusion, and the terrifying possibility that Israel's much vaunted edge in military power begins to erode under the weight of sheer numbers. A war on one front is difficult. A war on two fronts is dangerous. A war on three or more is destabilizing in ways Israel has not faced since its founding. Think about the timing of this escalation. Gaza has already stretched Israel's resources, drawing troops, intelligence, and weapons into a grinding conflict that shows no signs of ending. Hezbollah, with its tens of thousands of rockets, lurks on the northern border, threatening to unleash a rain of fire that could dwarf even Gaza's attacks. And now, Yemen, a country hundreds of miles away, a country that, until recently, was barely considered part of the equation, has forced its way into the fight with missiles that pierce the Iron Dome. That's not just a military escalation, that's a strategic earthquake. It signals that Israel's enemies are not only acting, but acting together, deliberately, relentlessly, and in ways designed to overwhelm. The hook here is the chilling reality of coordination. Each strike by itself may not bring Israel to its knees, but together, they form a storm too large to contain. Gaza bleeds Israel of focus. Hezbollah threatens the north. Yemen proves distance is no barrier. And what happens when Iran, the quiet power behind so many of these proxies, decides the moment has come to tighten the noose? Suddenly, Israel faces not a war of weeks, but a war of survival, a conflict that pushes its military and political systems to their breaking point. Inside Israel, the government knows this. Generals have long warned of the multi-front war, and tonight those warnings feel less like theory and more like prophecy. Every missile that lands, every explosion that rocks a neighborhood is not just an isolated incident, it is part of a larger pattern designed to exhaust, to fracture, to overwhelm. And exhaustion is the most dangerous enemy of all. Because once a nation begins to feel it cannot keep up, once civilians believe the state cannot protect them, faith begins to erode. And in war, faith is as vital as weapons. Here is another hook. This is not just about Israel. Washington is watching. Tehran is calculating. Riyadh is weighing its options. A multi-front war in Israel has ripple effects across the globe. Oil markets tremble. Diplomacy falters. The possibility of American troops being drawn into yet another Middle Eastern war grows. And all of this because Israel's enemies are playing a long game, stretching the battlefield, multiplying the fronts, and daring Israel and its allies to respond to all of them at once. What makes tonight so dangerous is not simply the bombs that fell, but the signal they send. The battlefield is no longer contained. The war is no longer limited. Israel's enemies are not acting alone. And when enemies stop acting alone, when they begin to coordinate, the balance of power begins to tilt. That is the new reality unfolding tonight. And it is a reality that will define the choices Israel makes, the choices America makes, and the choices that could determine whether the Middle East teeters on the edge of full-scale regional war. For decades, one of the few constants in American foreign policy has been unwavering support for Israel's security. It has been repeated by presidents of both parties, signed into law through billions of dollars in military aid, and defended on the floor of Congress as if it were an article of faith. The crown jewel of that support has been the Iron Dome, a missile defense system funded heavily by U.S. taxpayers, praised as proof that America and Israel together could achieve technological supremacy over any adversary. Tonight, however, that faith is being tested. With hundreds of bombs falling on Tel Aviv and Yemeni cluster missiles breaching defenses, the United States finds itself facing questions it cannot easily answer. What good is $1 billion shield if it fails when most needed? And what does it say about American policy when its cornerstone collapses in real time? The hook here is accountability. Americans were told that their money was buying safety. Safety not only for Israel, but for U.S. interests in the region. For years, lawmakers stood proudly behind funding packages pointing to high interception rates and images of rockets being destroyed in midair. But tonight's reality challenges that narrative. Taxpayers who rarely think about the Middle East may start asking why so many of their dollars are invested in a defense system that can still be overwhelmed by adversaries with far less sophisticated technology. In a political climate where every dollar spent overseas is scrutinized, this failure may become not just a foreign policy issue, but a domestic one. There is another dimension to this moment, and it is about perception. Washington has long sold its partnership with Israel as unbreakable, its commitment as ironclad, but when the world sees the Iron Dome penetrated, when they watch Tel Aviv scrambling under fire, the perception shifts. Adversaries do not just see Israel weakened, they see America's credibility questioned. If the United States cannot guarantee the safety of its closest ally in the Middle East, what does that mean for its promises to others? What does it mean for deterrence in the region or for allies in Europe and Asia who rely on American defense commitments? That is the hidden cost of tonight's explosions. The credibility of American guarantees suddenly looks less certain. The hook is vulnerability, not just for Israel, but for Washington itself. For decades, U.S. officials have insisted that their investments in Israel are investments in stability, that supporting the Iron Dome prevents larger wars, that American money saves lives on both sides. But now, with a multi-front conflict emerging and Israel's defenses compromised, critics will argue that this policy has not prevented escalation. It may have only delayed it. Billions spent, promises made, and still the bombs fell. That line of attack will not just come from foreign governments, it will come from members of Congress, from candidates on the campaign trail, from citizens wondering whether America's priorities abroad align with their struggles at home. At the same time, Washington cannot walk away. The hook here is that the United States is trapped by its own commitments. To withdraw support now would signal weakness, embolden adversaries, and further destabilize the region. To double down, to send more aid, more weapons, more money, risks pouring resources into a defense system that has already shown its flaws. It is the classic foreign policy dilemma, damned if you do, damned if you don't. And every move will be watched closely by allies and enemies alike. The political fallout in the United States will be immediate. Some lawmakers will call for more funding, arguing that the Iron Dome needs upgrades to face new threats. Others will argue that this proves the futility of endless spending abroad, while American infrastructure and healthcare remain underfunded. In a divided political environment, this failure could become another wedge, another line of attack, another debate that pits national security against domestic priorities. And in that debate, the images of Tel Aviv under fire will be replayed again and again. Tonight's breach is not just a problem for Israel, it is a reckoning for U.S. policy. It forces Washington to confront a truth it has long avoided. Technology alone cannot guarantee security, money alone cannot buy stability, and promises alone cannot deter determined adversaries. The Iron Dome was supposed to be the symbol of American-Israeli strength. Tonight, it is the symbol of their vulnerability. And in politics, symbols matter as much as reality. That is the storm now facing Washington. A storm of questions, doubts, and consequences that will not fade when the smoke clears. Power in the Middle East has never been static. It shifts like sand in the desert, sometimes slowly over years, other times violently in the space of a single night. What happened when Yemeni cluster missiles broke through Israel's defenses is more than a military event. It is a tremor that signals a larger shift in the regional balance of power. For decades, Israel has been presented as the dominant force, a state with unmatched military superiority, protected not only by its own technology and training, but by the financial and political backing of the United States. But tonight, the narrative of supremacy has been interrupted, and in that interruption, Israel's adversaries see something far more valuable than one night's victory. They see momentum. They see the possibility of change. And that, perhaps more than the missiles themselves, is the true danger. The hook is perception. Wars are not only fought with bombs and bullets, they are fought with stories. The story of Israel until now has been that it is untouchable, its defense is too strong, its allies too committed. But when Yemen, one of the poorest countries in the Arab world, can launch a strike that rattles Tel Aviv, that story collapses. It emboldens Hezbollah, which holds tens of thousands of rockets in Lebanon. It energizes Hamas in Gaza, which has long looked for signs that Israel's armor could crack. It encourages Iran, the power behind so many of these proxies, to test just how far the pressure can go. And it reminds Saudi Arabia, the Gulf states, even Turkey, that the power dynamic they have lived with for years may be entering a new chapter. This is how power shifts, not with declarations, but with moments that reveal vulnerability. The breach of the Iron Dome is one of those moments, and it is not only the enemies of Israel who notice. Allies across the world are recalculating. European governments, who have long walked a careful line between supporting Israel and appealing to Arab partners, may now see opportunity to push for greater influence in regional diplomacy. Russia and China, always eager to highlight American weakness, will use this as evidence that U.S. power in the region is slipping, that Washington can no longer guarantee security for its allies. In the halls of power from Moscow to Beijing, tonight's explosions will be analyzed as signs of an emerging order, one where Israel and the United States are not the sole arbiters of strength. The hook here is that weakness is contagious. Once exposed, it does not stay confined. Israel's setback becomes America's problem. America's problem becomes NATO's concern. And soon, a single night in Tel Aviv becomes part of a global conversation about whether the West is losing its grip on the balance of power, not just in the Middle East, but worldwide. This is the domino effect of vulnerability. When the region's most powerful military is shaken, every player on the board begins to move differently. Inside Israel, this power shift creates a political earthquake. A government that promised safety now faces doubts not only from its people, but from its allies. Opposition leaders will argue that Netanyahu has allowed the nation's deterrence to erode, that years of focusing on political survival distracted from military readiness. And in Washington, where Israel's security has always been taken as a given, strategists will have to rethink assumptions about the region's stability. The unspoken question becomes louder: if Israel is no longer invincible, how long can America afford to tie itself so closely to its fortunes? And then there is Iran. The hook that cannot be ignored is Iran's role as the architect behind much of this proxy warfare. For years, Iran has been patient, watching Israel expand settlements, watching the U.S. withdraw from Iraq and Afghanistan, watching regional dynamics shift. With every missile that slips past Israeli defenses, Iran's strategy of surrounding Israel with armed proxies looks more effective. And when Iran looks effective, the balance of deterrence begins to tilt. That tilt is what tonight's attack represents. Not just a battle lost or won, but a rebalancing of fear. Fear that once belonged to Israel's enemies may now be flowing back into Israel itself. This is not the end of Israel's power, but it is a moment when the perception of its dominance, the perception that has held the region in check, has cracked. And when perceptions crack, power shifts. What was once unquestionable is now in doubt. And in geopolitics, doubt is the opening through which rivals push hardest. That is the story tonight, a region watching closely, adversaries celebrating, allies reconsidering, and Israel confronting the chilling possibility that the era of unquestioned dominance may be ending right before our eyes. War is often measured in numbers: the number of missiles fired, the number of defenses launched, the number of casualties reported. But behind every statistic lies a story, and tonight in Tel Aviv and beyond, those stories are written in fear, loss, and uncertainty. When hundreds of bombs rain down on a city, it is not only infrastructure that breaks, it is the human spirit that shatters. Parents clutch children and run for cover, unsure if the next strike will land on their building. Families gather in shelters, listening to the earth shake above them, each explosion a reminder of their own fragility. This is the human cost of escalation, and it is the part of war that cannot be measured in military reports or political speeches. The hook here is empathy. Because behind the global headlines about Iron Dome breaches and geopolitical shifts, the truth is that ordinary people, civilians who had no role in firing a rocket or designing a defense system, are the ones paying the price. In Tel Aviv, where just yesterday life was normal, people now huddle in underground garages converted into makeshift shelters. Children ask questions their parents cannot answer. Elderly residents, unable to move quickly, sit trembling as sirens blare. Hospitals strain under the influx of the wounded, while doctors and nurses work through exhaustion, knowing every bed filled is another life permanently scarred by war. It is tempting for leaders to speak of precision strikes, of controlled responses, of deterrence. But there is no precision in fear. There is no control in chaos, and every rocket that slips past defenses lands not on a target board, but in someone's neighborhood, on someone's street, near someone's home. The hook is the universality of human pain. No matter which side of the conflict you stand on, the suffering of civilians looks the same. Parents in Tel Aviv, parents in Gaza, parents in Yemen, all fear the same sound of incoming fire. All grieve the same loss when children are buried under rubble. This is the side of war leaders rarely emphasize, but it is the one that endures longest after the smoke clears. The psychological cost of escalation may be even greater than the physical. Once civilians realize that no place is truly safe, they begin to live in a constant state of anxiety. In Tel Aviv tonight, families may sleep in shifts, afraid to close their eyes. Children will wake from nightmares that echo the real explosions they heard. Schoolyards will sit empty. Businesses will shutter. Life itself becomes a casualty long before statistics are counted. And here lies the hook. Terror is not just about bombs. It is about destroying the normal rhythms of life. It is about replacing confidence with dread, replacing laughter with silence. For soldiers and first responders, The cost is also profound. These are men and women who rush toward danger while others flee. They carry bodies from rubble, they comfort the traumatized, and they often do so while their own families are at risk. The strain of endless alerts, of being pulled in every direction during a multi-front war, leaves scars no uniform can hide. And for those who survive physically, the invisible wounds, the trauma, the guilt, the exhaustion will remain. These are the untold costs of escalation, the costs that rarely make headlines but shape societies for generations. The hook is that escalation feeds itself. Every death fuels anger. Every injury breeds resentment. Every child traumatized today becomes an adult with memories that may harden into hatred tomorrow. And so the cycle continues, fueled not only by politics and power, but by the deeply personal grief etched into families on both sides of the conflict. Leaders calculate strategies, but civilians absorb the consequences, and those consequences, multiplied by hundreds and thousands, are what make peace harder to imagine with every passing day. Tonight, as analysts debate missile ranges and defense failures, we cannot forget the human dimension. The faces of mothers shielding children, the voices of families calling loved ones in panic, the silence of neighborhoods left in ruins, these are the real markers of this moment. They are the cost of escalation, the price of war, and the reason why this story is not only about military might or political fallout, but about humanity itself, tested once again under the weight of endless conflict.